think there were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was of an astonishingly wide range of organisations.
For years, the British tabloids ran wild with a story the palace refused to confirm or deny. Britain's most beloved royal couple, married for over 7 decades, were living apart, not in separate wings of the same palace, not in adjacent suites behind the same grand doors, but miles apart, one at the center of the monarchy's beating heart, the other at a quiet, modest farmhouse on the edge of a Norfolk estate, overlooking the sea. The rumors were ruthless, the headlines were merciless, and the public? The public was desperate to know the truth. Now, finally, Princess Anne, the most straight-talking, no-nonsense member of the royal family, has broken her silence. And what she's revealed changes everything you thought you knew about the marriage of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. Stay with us, because this story is not what the tabloids told you. And honestly, it's far more powerful. The question everyone was asking. Let's go back to 2017. Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, had just done something no one in royal history had quite done before. At the age of 96, after completing more than 22,000 solo royal engagements over 65 years, he officially retired from public life.
A solo royal engagement like this. They won't use the word officially, but in effect he's retiring from the role he's played in public life for more than 60 years.
22,000 engagements. Let that sink in for a moment. That is not a career. That is a lifetime of service so immense it is almost impossible to comprehend. And when he retired, the world assumed he would settle quietly beside his wife of 70 years at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. That's what most couples do, right? After a lifetime of hard work, you come home. You sit beside the person you love. You rest together. But Prince Philip didn't do that. Instead, he moved to Wood Farm, a 5-bedroom cottage tucked away in a secluded corner of the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, miles away from where the Queen was carrying out her duties. No grand ballrooms, no army of uniformed staff, no gilded ceilings, just a modest, timber-beamed farmhouse with views of the sea. And the tabloids? They had a field day. "Royal rift!" screamed one headline. "Philip abandons palace!" shouted another. 73 years of marriage, and now this!
For more than 7 decades, Prince Philip stood dutifully behind his wife in the longest marriage in British royal history,
wrote a third. But here's the question that nobody in the press was actually brave enough to ask seriously. What if the tabloids were completely wrong? What if this arrangement wasn't a sign of trouble, but a sign of something far deeper, far more mature, and far more beautiful than anything the gossip columns could ever understand? That is exactly what Princess Anne is now telling us. And it starts with a tradition so deeply embedded in British aristocratic culture that most people outside of it have simply never heard of it. The secret tradition the upper class never discusses. Before we get to Wood Farm, before we get to the retirement years, before we get to Princess Anne's revelation, we need to go all the way back to 1947, because the story of Philip and Elizabeth's unconventional arrangement didn't begin in their 90s. It began on their wedding night. When Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip moved into Clarence House in 1949 as newlyweds, they did not share a bedroom. This wasn't a secret. It wasn't a scandal. In the circles they moved in, it was simply normal. Lady Pamela Hicks, Philip's own cousin and one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, explained this with remarkable frankness in her biography. She described an upper-class British tradition of maintaining separate bedrooms, not out of coldness or distance, but out of practicality and the preservation of personal space. The logic, she explained, was elegantly simple. You don't want to be disturbed. You don't want to compromise the quality of your rest. But, and this is the crucial part, when you feel close and tender, you can always choose to be together. The choice itself becomes the intimacy. Read that again. The choice itself becomes the intimacy. This is not a cold arrangement. This is not a loveless one. This is a couple who, from the very beginning of their marriage, understood something that modern relationship psychology is only now beginning to catch up with. That love does not require constant physical proximity to remain alive. That two people can be deeply, completely devoted to one another while still honoring each other's need for space, silence, and solitude. Their bedrooms at Clarence House were adjacent, connecting. There were doors between them. They could be together whenever they wanted. They simply weren't required to be. And this arrangement followed them everywhere. Buckingham Palace, connecting bedrooms; Windsor Castle, connecting bedrooms; Balmoral, Sandringham, every royal residence they ever inhabited. For 73 years, from 1947 until Philip's death in 2021, this was how they lived. So when Philip moved to Wood Farm in 2017, he wasn't doing something radical or new. He was simply extending a principle that had governed their marriage since day one. The principle that love flourishes best when each person's individual needs are honored. And Princess Anne, who grew up watching this dynamic between her parents, understood it better than almost anyone. Wood Farm, the place the palace never wanted you to understand. Now let's talk about Wood Farm itself. Because this cottage is not just a building, it is a window into who Prince Philip really was, beneath all the ceremony and the protocol and the carefully maintained public image. Wood Farm sits on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, described by those who know it as a comfortable, open-beamed cottage about 2 miles from the main Sandringham house. It overlooks the sea. It is quiet. It is modest. And by royal standards, it is almost startlingly ordinary. When Philip moved in, he didn't just take up residence. He transformed the space into something that was entirely, authentically his. He oversaw the installation of a new kitchen. He decorated the walls with his own watercolor paintings. He redesigned the bedrooms and rearranged spaces to suit his personal preferences. Think about what that means. Here is a man who, for 7 decades, had lived in palaces designed by other people, maintained by other people, governed by centuries of protocol that dictated what went where and who stood where and what was appropriate for every occasion. He had walked 3 steps behind his wife at every public engagement. He had suppressed his own considerable intellect and ambitions to serve as consort to the most famous woman on earth. And now, at 96, in a 5-bedroom farmhouse in Norfolk, he finally had a home that was his, decorated with his own art, arranged the way he wanted, filled with his own books and his own pursuits. He painted watercolors, a hobby he had loved for years, but rarely had time to pursue during his decades of active service. He read extensively. He reportedly ran a truffle farm on the grounds. He invited friends to stay, something the rigid formality of palace life made genuinely difficult. And perhaps most tellingly of all, the staff at Wood Farm did not wear uniforms. In the context of the British royal family, that detail is almost revolutionary. The machinery of the monarchy runs on ritual, on visual distinction, on the constant maintenance of hierarchy. At Buckingham Palace, every member of staff has their place, their uniform, their title, their protocol. At Wood Farm, none of that, just people, living simply. And when Queen Elizabeth visited, which she did regularly, far more often than the press reported, she didn't sit in a throne room while staff anticipated her every need. She cooked, she did the dishes. The Queen of England, standing at a kitchen sink in a Norfolk cottage, washing up after dinner. That image should stop you cold, because it tells you everything about what Wood Farm really was. It wasn't a retreat from their marriage, it was the truest expression of it. Princess Anne speaks what she really said. Now we come to the heart of it, the moment that has sent ripples through royal watchers and historians alike. Princess Anne, known for her directness, her refusal to perform emotion for the cameras, her fierce protectiveness of her family's real private life, has spoken about her parents' arrangement with a candor that is both surprising and, once you hear it, completely inevitable. Anne has consistently maintained that the public and the press fundamentally misunderstood the dynamic between her mother and her father. In her view, and in the view of those closest to the family, the tabloid narrative of a fractured, distant marriage was not just wrong. It was an insult to 2 people who had built one of the most genuinely committed partnerships in modern history. What Anne has made clear is this: the separation between Buckingham Palace and Wood Farm was never about emotional distance. It was about deep, mutual respect. Her mother, Queen Elizabeth, had a job. Not in the way most of us have jobs, something we can choose to set aside, something with holidays and weekends, and the option to retire. The Queen's role was constitutional. constitutional in the most literal sense. The machinery of the British state required her physical presence. Weekly audiences with the Prime Minister, investitures, state banquets, the reception of foreign dignitaries, the endless, unbreakable rhythm of royal duty that Elizabeth had committed herself to at the age of 21 and never once broken. Her father, meanwhile, had earned, truly and completely earned, the right to rest. Princess Anne has spoken about her father's sacrifice in terms that are both fiercely admiring and quietly heartbreaking. Philip gave up a career in the Royal Navy that, by every account, he was brilliantly suited for and genuinely loved. He gave up the normal expressions of masculine authority that men of his generation and class expected as their birthright. He walked behind his wife in public for 7 decades. He smiled and shook hands and made conversation and attended ceremonies for causes he may or may not have found personally compelling, because that was his role and he performed it without complaint. By 2017, he had given everything. And what Princess Anne wants the world to understand is that her mother gave him the only gift truly worthy of that sacrifice: freedom. Not freedom from their marriage, freedom within it. Freedom to live quietly, to paint, to read, to breathe without the weight of protocol pressing down on every moment of every day. Queen Elizabeth didn't just allow this arrangement. According to those who knew them, she actively supported it, encouraged it, and honored it as the expression of love it truly was. That is the revelation Princess Anne is laying bare. The separate residences weren't a failure of the marriage. They were its highest achievement, the proof that after 70 years together, these two people still understood and respected each other's deepest needs. And now ask yourself honestly, how many couples, after 70 years, can say the same? The history of Wood Farm, a place woven into royal DNA. To truly understand why Philip chose Wood Farm, you need to understand that this cottage was never just a random property. It was a place threaded through decades of royal history, some of it joyful, some of it deeply sorrowful. The royal family began using Wood Farm in 1967, when Philip himself selected it as a retreat for family members and guests, free from the formality and expense of the main Sandringham house. Over the following 5 decades, it became one of those rare royal spaces that felt genuinely private, a place where the family could exhale. Prince Charles, during his university years, began hosting shooting parties at Wood Farm and continued to use it as a country retreat well into adulthood. Princess Diana stayed there before her engagement to Charles was announced, in those early, hopeful days when the story of her relationship with the Prince of Wales still seemed like a fairy tale. Catherine Middleton, now the Princess of Wales, visited the cottage early in her relationship with Prince William, on a trip to Sandringham that signaled how seriously the family was beginning to take the relationship. But Wood Farm also carries a shadow, a story that the royal family has rarely discussed publicly, and that most people, even ardent royal watchers, don't know. In 1917, King George V and Queen Mary made a devastating decision. Their youngest son, Prince John, had been suffering from increasingly severe epileptic seizures. The seizures were worsening. The public appearances were becoming impossible. And so, in an act that history has judged with varying degrees of harshness, the young prince was quietly sent to live at Wood Farm, away from the main family. Prince John lived at Wood Farm for 2 years. He died there in 1919, at just 13 years old. It is a chapter of royal history that sits uncomfortably alongside the cottage's warmer legacy. And yet, somehow, Wood Farm absorbed even that grief and continued to serve the family as a place of retreat, of renewal, of quiet escape from the demands of public life. When Philip chose it for his retirement, he was choosing a place soaked in family history, a place he had personally selected and shaped decades earlier, a place that felt, in the deepest sense, like home, not a palace, not a residence maintained for its constitutional significance, a home. The COVID reunion, when separation gave way to togetherness. Then came March 2020, and everything changed. The COVID-19 pandemic swept across Britain with terrifying speed. At 98 years old, Prince Philip was in the highest possible risk category, elderly, with a pre-existing heart condition, and a body that, despite a lifetime of remarkable vitality, was finally beginning to show its age. The arrangement that had worked so well for 3 years, Philip at Wood Farm, Elizabeth fulfilling her duties, was no longer tenable. The risk was simply too great. And so Philip left Wood Farm. He moved to Windsor Castle to be with the Queen. For the first time in years, they were living together, fully, completely, daily. Just the two of them, with minimal staff, in what royal biographers would later affectionately call the HMS Bubble, a self-contained world of two, sealed off from the pandemic, raging outside the castle walls. And here is what strikes me about that moment, and what I want you to sit with. This was a couple in their late 90s. They had been married for over 70 years. They had separate bedrooms, separate residences, separate daily rhythms. By any tabloid definition, theirs was a distanced relationship, and yet, the moment real danger arrived, there was no hesitation, no negotiation, no reluctance. Philip simply came home, to Windsor, to Elizabeth.
Later today, a funeral service will take place for Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Let's take you to the scene live in Windsor, just west of London.
To the place where they could face uncertainty together. Does that sound like a broken marriage to you? Because to me, it sounds like the definition of an unbreakable one. They spent that time together in a way they hadn't in years, unhurried, unscheduled, away from the machinery of public life. And while Philip's health was declining, while his mobility was limited, and his hospital stays were becoming more frequent, he and Elizabeth were present with each other in a way that protocol and duty had sometimes made difficult. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, passed away on April 9, 2021 at Windsor Castle. He was 99 years old. He died not at Wood Farm, the place of his retirement, but at Windsor, the place where he and Elizabeth had chosen to weather the pandemic together, the place where, in the end, they were side by side. After Philip, the Queen and the cottage she couldn't let go. What happened after Philip's death tells you perhaps more about the truth of their marriage than anything that came before. Queen Elizabeth II, the most stoic, most duty-bound monarch in modern British history, a woman who had maintained her composure through wars and crises and personal tragedies that would have broken most people, was broken by this loss. Not publicly, never publicly, but in the small private ways that people who knew her could see. And where did she go? Wood Farm. In the months following Philip's death, Elizabeth returned to the cottage again and again. She flew by helicopter to Sandringham and chose to stay not at Sandringham House, but at Wood Farm itself, Philip's cottage, Philip's space, the place where his watercolor paintings still hung on the walls, and the kitchen he had designed was still exactly as he had left it. She stayed there around the anniversary of her father, King George VI's death on February 6th, a date that had always carried profound personal significance for her, marking the moment in 1952 when she had become queen and Philip had become consort, when the shape of their entire shared life had been determined. She wasn't visiting Wood Farm despite the memories. She was visiting because of them. Think about what it means to return to the place where the person you loved was happiest, to sit in the rooms they arranged, surrounded by the art they created, in the kitchen where you once cooked simple meals together and washed the dishes side by side while the Norfolk wind came off the sea. That is not the behavior of someone who lived apart from their spouse because the marriage had grown cold. That is the behavior of someone who is still, even in grief, reaching for the presence of the person they loved most. In her final years, between Philip's death in April 2021 and her own passing in September 2022, Elizabeth returned to Wood Farm multiple times. The cottage had become sacred ground, the most honest expression of their marriage, the place where the crown had been set aside and two people had simply been themselves. What 73 years really teaches us. So what does this story actually mean? What does it teach us, not just about Philip and Elizabeth, but about love itself? We live in a culture saturated with a very specific idea of what a successful relationship looks like. Togetherness, constant closeness, the couple that does everything together, that is always in the same room, that cannot imagine a morning without the other person within arm's reach. We have romanticized inseparability to the point where any deviation from it, separate bedrooms, separate holidays, time spent genuinely apart, is treated as a warning sign, a red flag, evidence that something has gone wrong. But Philip and Elizabeth challenge every single part of that assumption. And they do it across 73 years of evidence. From their very first home together, they maintained separate bedrooms, not because their marriage was cold, because they understood that quality sleep, personal space, and individual privacy are not the enemies of intimacy. They are its foundation. You cannot give fully to another person if you are perpetually depleted, perpetually without solitude, perpetually without the room to simply be yourself. In Philip's retirement, this principle extended further. He moved to a cottage he loved. She continued the work she had committed her life to. They visited each other regularly. They spoke. They shared the moments that mattered. And when the world turned dark and dangerous in 2020, they came together without a second thought, spending the final year of Philip's life side by side. Princess Anne's revelation is not really a revelation about logistics. It is a revelation about the nature of love at its most mature, its most seasoned, its most honest. Love that does not demand. Love that does not cling. Love that says, I know who you are. I know what you need. And I honor that, even when it means we are not in the same room. That is a harder kind of love than the breathless, can't-be-apart kind. It requires more trust, more security, more genuine knowledge of another person. Most couples never reach it, because reaching it requires decades of truly paying attention. Philip and Elizabeth had 73 years to learn each other, and what they learned, they honored, right up until the end. The tabloids were wrong, and here's why it matters. Before we close, let's say directly what needs to be said. The tabloids got this wrong, badly, repeatedly, and without consequence. For years, British newspapers ran stories implying that the separate living arrangement between Philip and Elizabeth was a sign of marital failure. They speculated about estrangement, about decades of accumulated resentment, about a royal marriage that had survived in name only. They built entire narratives on a foundation of willful misunderstanding. And the damage from that is real, because every person who read those headlines and believed them came away with a diminished view of two people who deserved better, who had given their lives, both of them, in different but equally total ways, to service and duty, who had built a partnership so solid and so deep that it could accommodate individual needs without fracturing. Princess Anne's frustration with this narrative is palpable and completely justified. Her parents were not estranged. They were adapted. There is an enormous difference, and the failure to recognize it says more about our cultural assumptions than it does about the Windsors. The real story is this: a man who gave 70 years of service earned the right to retire in peace. A woman who gave her entire life to a constitutional role continued to fulfill it with the dignity and commitment she had always shown. They loved each other well enough to support each other's very different needs in their 90s, and when the moment came to be together, they were. That is not a story of a broken marriage. That is a story of one of the most successful partnerships in modern history. Here is what I keep coming back to, and I want you to sit with this as we close. After Philip died, Elizabeth flew to a Norfolk cottage and stayed there. She cooked in his kitchen. She slept in the rooms he had made his own. She looked at the watercolors he had painted and hung on the walls. She stayed until at least February 6th, the anniversary of her accession, the day that had defined the entire shape of their shared life. She was 95 years old, a widow, the Queen of England, and she was spending her nights in a 5-bedroom farmhouse because that was where he had been happiest, because being close to the place he loved was the closest she could still get to him. If that doesn't tell you everything about the truth of their marriage, nothing will. Princess Anne was right to speak. The world needed to hear it. Philip and Elizabeth didn't live apart because something was broken. They lived apart because everything was whole enough, strong enough, and real enough to let each other be fully, freely, exactly who they were. 73 years, separate bedrooms, eventually separate homes, and one of the greatest love stories of the 20th century. Now tell me honestly, in the comments below, does this change the way you see their marriage? Did you believe the tabloid narrative at the time? And do you think there's a lesson in Philip and Elizabeth's story that we could all apply to the relationships in our own lives? Drop your thoughts below, because this conversation is far from over. And if this story moved you the way it moved us, if it made you see this remarkable couple differently, share it, because some stories deserve to be told properly.